All right. All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to, or actually, we're recording this. So thank you for tuning into this video on resumes and CVs. We are the SACNAS chapter here at UW-Madison. And then we're going to introduce ourselves very quickly. My name is Jaime Cordova. I'm a PhD student in the genetics department. I'm the president of the SACNAS chapter here at UW-Madison. And I'll let the rest of the board introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is David Ortiz. I'm the vice president. I'm a PhD student at the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison.
Hi, I'm Kendra. I am the outreach chair for the SACNAS chapter. I'm a PhD student in comparative biomedical sciences.
Hi, my name is Kim. I'm also a PhD student in the microbiology doctoral training program, and I'm currently the treasurer of the chapter.
Cool. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. So yeah, we're recording this. We have a very brief presentation regarding CVs and resumes, and really the goal behind this is because REU applications or research experience opportunities for undergrads are those applications are usually due around January, February, and really it can vary depending on the program. So we wanted to have this as an initial series or as an initial video sort of to introduce you all to how CVs and resumes work for that. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen and we'll make this available or we'll make these slides available so you can look through them. And we also invite that if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. And we'll have a little discussion at the end regarding some common questions that personally we felt that are usually not addressed in regards to CVs and resumes. So first, we'll start off again, CVs and resumes, and I'd like to thank a lot of this information came from Dr. Corey Welch at Iowa State University. So I'd like to thank him for sharing this with us, and also David, who also made this available to us, who originally came from Iowa State. So first, a little bit of discussion on we'll go over what the difference between a CV and a resume is. We'll talk a little bit about where you use a CV and where you use a resume. And then we'll go over very briefly over some examples. And we'll talk a little bit also about how you can make what encompasses a CV. Now we are going to give a quick disclaimer that there are multiple ways to make a CV or a resume. I personally have gone through multiple ways of making a CV in my time in academia. So there isn't just one single way we're presenting here. We're presenting our own experiences. It is sort of biased towards PhD or towards a PhD program and academia because we are all PhD students. But the important thing to remember is that the basics of a CV and the basics of what we're presenting here, they generally apply for any type of resume or CV. So it's not just for academia. But probably the most important thing is that while we are giving you this advice, or while we are sharing our advice from our own perspectives as PhD students, we definitely recommend to talk to advisors for specifics on your field, and also to ensure that you're looking at what that particular opportunity is looking for, to ensure that you're covering basically what they want and you're giving them the information that they want. And by the way, if you guys have any questions or want to touch in on anything, feel free to chime in, guys. So, all right. So a little bit about the differences between a CV and a resume. So first, starting off with a resume, it's usually a summary, meaning that you usually want to stick to 1 page, 2 pages maximum, if that. Normally, I've only ever seen 1 page, but obviously, if you've got a lot that you need to write about or a lot of information that is relevant, usually it's acceptable to go to 2 pages. This is more common for industry jobs or jobs that are, let's say, for example, outside of academia. And the part about a resume, so again, it's a summary. They don't cover a whole career. They're generally customizable for the job that you're applying to. So for example, when I was applying as a museum guide to a museum, right? When I was applying there, I had already had a job at a paint store, the paint store opportunity wasn't necessarily relevant, so I didn't really focus on that, but I made sure to mention it because it was something that I had customer service experience, but it wasn't completely relevant to that job, so I didn't focus on that. This is all opposed to a CV, where so CV stands for curriculum vitae or vitas, depending on who you ask. It's a detailed summary, and this is more common in academia, health, government, and education. And there's usually no, before this, there's usually no limit to this. So it can be 1 page, it can be 5 pages, it could be 10 pages. I've seen some that are even longer. That's usually for people who are professors and who have been in academia for a very long time, but there really is no limit. And it's usually static, meaning that it doesn't change for the job. So you want to provide a whole history. Now, just because it doesn't change for the job but you are providing all of your academic history or all of your research experience, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't tailor it to whatever it is that you're applying to. So for example, if I was applying to something in plant genetics, and I had a plant genetics experience, but I also had a experience in cancer genetics, then I would include both, but I would want to give a little bit more emphasis to my plant genetics experience, because that's what's important for the position that I'm applying to, but definitely want to include both. Now, the goal of a CV and a resume, there's really 2 goals. Is one, you want to avoid making mistakes that'll end up getting it ignored or tossed aside. When people are applying to research experiences, they are looking at tens, potentially hundreds of applications. So you want to make sure that yours isn't thrown out for, for a simple mistake that you could have easily caught. And also the goal is to get an interview. So at least, for example, for PhD applications, you submit your applications, you submit your CV, and you get an interview. And then once you get an interview, then you figure out that's when you actually present yourself in person to determine whether you're going to go into the program. So these are really the 2 goals. Now let's talk about where to start. And again, we are focusing on CVs for this particular talk. But again, this is all really sort of applicable to resumes as well. And I'll point out a couple of things that are that tend to appear more for resumes than CVs. So we recommend that you start off with including everything that you've done, and we mean academically. So make it sort of a laundry list and edit it down. And you'd want to group your experiences into certain subcategories, and we'll mention what those categories are, or what good categories to start off with are in a little bit. We recommend something that I started doing a couple of years ago, for example, is to have a master document that you can edit it down for a specific position. So for example, I have a master CV. If I'm going to apply to a fellowship, then I take out stuff that maybe isn't applicable to that fellowship. Or if let's say, for example, if I for some reason needed to apply to a job, then I would take out stuff that wasn't applicable to that job. But it's better to have everything in one place as opposed to having multiple documents and having to add to them. And it's also really good to make sure to frequently be updating this, because you can leave it alone for like a year and maybe you had 2 or 3 presentations and you'll forget, oh, where did I present? What fellowship did I get, or something along those lines. And yeah, as I mentioned, we'll mention some of the standard subcategories later. Now, Microsoft Word and other programs usually have versions that you can adopt, but you'll see that a lot of these look very fancy. They have a lot of graphics, stuff like that. With formatting, you usually want to keep it very plain. You don't want photos, you don't want any weird borders or odd fonts. So that's usually what you'll see with the standard templates like on Word. You want to use bold or underline things that you want the reader to focus on, and it really is important to emphasize content, especially with a CV. For example, if you've got a 5-6 page CV that talks about a lot of things, you want to really be able to, again, pinpoint what it is that you want them to focus on, because it can very easily get lost when you're looking at a stack of tens to hundreds of applications. And you also want to be consistent with formatting. So bold and italicized consistently, location of dates, the location of titles and stuff like that. Personally, what I would recommend, something that I started doing a couple of years ago, and I'm sure the rest of the board would recommend, and really any grad student would probably recommend this to you, is to make a table within your document, because that helps keep it all organized. It helps you, for example, on the left, I have the name of the opportunity, a little bit about what I did. On the right, I have the dates, and it helps keep it organized as opposed to having to tab and enter and do all that stuff. And then you just get rid of the borders, and it makes it really easy for you to maintain that formatting. And then obviously no typos. That's one of the things that normally you're not going to get dinged. Your application isn't going to get thrown out if you misspelled one word, but you obviously don't want it to be a huge problem that could potentially reject your application. And you also want to avoid page run-ons. So basically what that means is don't try and format it in a sense where, let's say, for example, I'm halfway through a sentence and then the second half goes into the next page. You want to make sure not to do that and try and format it properly. Some more tips on formatting. The dates and activities should be in a section, and they should be ordered from recent to oldest. That's usually a common practice both for CVs and resumes. And you want to use 11 to 12 point font, standard for what you would normally see, for example, in an essay or something along those lines. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to have any odd fonts. Don't get fancy with, something like, I don't know, Lucida handwriting or something like that. You want to stick to a font that's common and neutral. Times New Roman, Calibri, stuff like that are all really good fonts to stick to. And then 1-inch margins. And again, we're giving these descriptions, but these could very well depend on where it is that you're applying or what program it is that you're applying to, because that everyone could have these different places that you're applying to could definitely have their own rules. Now we are going to, so here are those important possible subcategories, and we are going to talk a little bit about some that are there's a lot of discussion, at least in academia, about whether something should be included or not. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Obviously, you want to include your name. You want to have a section on your education. So you want to talk both about, usually you want to go down just to your undergrad level. If you're fresh out of high school, for example, let's say you're a freshman or a sophomore, you could definitely include that. But if you're a senior in your undergrad, then you just want to stick to your undergrad application, or to your undergrad education. You can mention definitely want to mention your research experience. And with that research experience, something that we'll talk about is there are pluses and minuses to having a sort of a narrative to that. So describing what it is that you actually did. You want to mention your publications and presentations, and we'll go over how you should format that. Any sort of related professional experience. So maybe it's not necessarily research experience and it's not publications and presentations, but this could be, let's say you participated in some workshop, a bioinformatics workshop, then that's something that you would want to include there. If you've had any sort of teaching experience, this isn't common for undergrads, but let's say if for some reason you were a TA for one of your undergrad classes, then you can definitely include that. And that's actually pretty critical and pretty important to have on there. It could also, actually, let's take that out. I forgot to take that out. You want to include any fellowships or grants or awards or scientific memberships that you have. Now, in regards to scientific memberships, usually you want it to be, so let's say, for example, we're all part of SACNAS. That's something that you definitely want to include. But if it's something that's maybe, very broad, you don't have to put it, and you don't have to worry, or I would argue that you wouldn't have to worry if you don't have any scientific memberships to put on there. So for example, when I was applying for graduate school, I had SACNAS on there because that was the only membership that I was a part of. But that isn't necessarily a huge issue, but you definitely want to make sure to include any fellowships, grants, or awards that you've gotten. And those awards should be academic related. So for example, if you got President's Honors List or Dean's Honors List, that's something that you definitely want to include on there. And you also want to include any other relevant skills. This really depends. And again, it should be relevant to the position you're applying to. So languages, if you're applying for a PhD program, it doesn't necessarily matter what languages you speak. But let's say, for example, you have a specialized skill or specialized training. You know, you're fluent, you're able to work in Python, you're able to work in R or something like that. That's definitely something that you want to be able to include. And again, there are a couple of other things that we'll mention at the end. Or that we'll have a discussion at the end about what, if you should include those or not, or what our thoughts are, I should say. Now, in regards to publications and presentations, so you want to include all abstracts, posters, symposiums, talks, manuscripts. In regards to manuscripts, we'll have a discussion again at the end whether those that haven't been submitted should be included. There's a lot of different conversations about that. You want to use the format that you would use, for example, if you're citing a paper. So, for example, here, the authors, if you're not the first author of a paper, I would recommend to bold or underline your name. That way it really stands out where you are. The year, title of the paper, journal name, volume, so on and so forth. And then for abstracts or posters or talks, so in other words, things that aren't peer reviewed. So let's say you presented at a conference, then here you would want to include, again, the name, sort of similarly, the name of the authors. You want to bold your name or underline it, the title, the talk, and the poster, and the name of the event, include the location. So for example, let's say last year SACNAS was in Hawaii, right? So I would put Cordova Jaime, evolutionary genetics of bacteria, SACNAS 2019, we're in 2020, Hawaii, Honolulu, Hawaii, October 2019, something along those lines. Now, a couple of facts about CVs. It rarely includes an objective. So this is a lot more common in resumes. So really, obviously, if you're applying for a CV, or I'm sorry, if you're applying for, you know, an academic position or an, what's the word I'm looking for? Or a research experience, then usually you know what that objective is, right? People will know what you're applying for. There also usually isn't a narrative profile. Now, basically what that means is, like, let's say, for example, I were to write, this is more common in a resume. So I would write a third-year PhD student interested in evolutionary genetics of bacteria and astrobiology, skills in molecular biology work. So you would include things like that. But again, that's more common in resumes. For CVs, you always want to mention, so for example, in your education or research experiences, you always want to mention schools, the school that you did it, or the institution that you did it, the people who you work with. You don't necessarily have to name drop, I worked with so-and-so and I did this, but for example, I would include, oh, I did work in XYZ's lab doing at University of Wisconsin doing this. And that's because you want to mention, academia is a small world, and you do want to mention who you're working with, but you don't have to name drop left and right. And again, the length isn't necessarily a problem. I've seen CVs that go on to be 10, 20 pages, sometimes even longer, but it does have to be relevant to the job that you're applying to. So, you know, you don't, if, for example, in CVs, you usually don't include, oh, I'm part of, I don't know, this random club on campus, unless you're, for example, in a leadership position or something along those lines. They also typically don't include the GPA, your GRE, or MCAT scores, but it definitely can be useful in the early stages. For example, if you're an undergrad applying to PhD programs, or if you're an undergrad applying to a research opportunity. Personally, I would say that I like the idea of including my GPA because, for example, in my case, I came from a community college and then I went to the university. My GPA in community college wasn't that great, but it really improved when I got to the university. So that's something that I wanted to showcase in my CV. So something like that, it could definitely be useful. You only want to list coursework if it's important, like if it's some sort of specialized training. So you don't want to include coursework that is standard for the major. So for example, my undergrad was a cell biologist. Well, everyone who's a cell biologist or in biology is going to have, for example, biology 101 or intro to bio, or probably organic chem or something like that. But you do want to include coursework that is important for the position, but maybe not as common. So for example, if I was applying to a genetics PhD program and I took a bioinformatics course as an undergrad, then I would definitely want to mention that, because not everyone who's applying to a program like that would have taken or would have applied to, or sorry, would have taken that course. And then you want to include, any sort of statistical skills or academic software skills. Again, if you have training in Python, if you have training in R, or something that's relevant to your field. And I use Python and R because those are things that I use, but it's definitely different for every case. So those are really the sort of basics. I'm going to open it up to everyone for these next couple of questions. So these are common questions about CVs that I've heard in conversations that we've discussed here amongst us as the group. And if there are any questions, you can definitely feel free to reach out to us, and we'll definitely be happy to try and answer these, or to look for information and get that information out to you all. So first is, do I include non-academic jobs? Now, I'll leave this open to everyone on discussing this. I'll personally say that one of the big things that I've seen in academia recently, when I was applying to graduate school like 3 years ago, I was encouraged to not mention it. Yeah, 3 years ago, right? 2 years ago. I was encouraged to not mention it. But there's definitely been a big push recently to make it okay to mention these. And the reason behind that is because as an undergrad, a lot of people unfortunately aren't getting paid for their undergrad research experience. So you're obviously having to make money somewhere else, working at a restaurant, working at a retail job or something like that. You're obviously being a student and also an employee somewhere, which is taking time away from your research and time away from your education. And it shows that you're working hard and that you're having to balance these different things. So I personally would argue that you should. But I'll leave it open to everyone to share their thoughts as well.
I would agree with you, Jaime. I think I've seen a couple of CVs recently where they have their jobs that they held during undergrad or during their year off of campus before applying to grad school. And yeah.
One thing that I did on my CV was I had, like the big research experience that I have. And then at the bottom, just in a small paragraph, other work experience. And then I listed like, I was a manager at this juice bar and I was a lead server and like all the other things that I had done, but I wasn't going to write like this experience included. So like for my research positions, I would put like, my research was about plant genetics and I used these molecular tools. I'm not going to write the same thing about being a manager at a juice bar. But I think it's important to look at what they're asking for as well. So different programs, even for my PhD, when I was applying to programs, some of them wanted a one-page CV that were very specific on what they wanted. Some of them just said, send us a resume, and there was no page limit. So I think it needs to be tailored to kind of what they're asking for. But if it's non-specific, I do like just including a small paragraph at the end that just says, I also did all these other things, no more details other than like what the position was.
Yeah, final note on that. I think it's important to include that, especially early on. Like Jaime said, not everyone is fortunate enough to get paid to go to school. So it's important to include those non-academic jobs. And it shows some skills that you build along the way. So like if you're a bartender or at a juice bar, you're learning how to be sociable, you're multitasking, you're doing a bunch of different things that are relatable to being in a lab. So I think it's important, and people should include it, especially early on.
Cool, thanks everyone. So just in summary, definitely one, most importantly, tailored specifically to what the institution or the program that you're applying to wants. But if they don't necessarily make it obvious, or they don't necessarily, strictly tell you we want a one-page CV or we only want to see this, then it's important to definitely share that, because that all not only is one something that you did during your undergraduate time, but two is also you also learn skills that are applicable in in academic situations. So the next question was, do I include references? So I'll say, I'll start off with saying that I've never seen references listed at the end of CV. I've only ever really seen it in example CVs, but you usually do see it in resumes. So, or it'll say, references listed, references available upon request. I don't know if you guys have any other ideas or any other thoughts on that.
I recently reformatted my CV, and on the application, the reason I reformatted it because the application asked to include the references in the CV instead of adding it to the application where they ask, oh, who's your reference, and you list the 3. Instead, it said to add it to the end of your CV. So I now have it at the end of mine, but I just have 2, and it's a table format.
I think that for most fellowships that I've applied for most PhD programs or research experience, they ask for letters of recommendation, and that's typically your references. So if you're getting letters of recommendation, I would say you don't need to include references. If they specifically ask for them, obviously include them. If not, I think it's kind of up to your judgment.
Cool. Yeah, I agree with that. The next question is, do I include publications that have not been submitted? And just for the sake of time, I'll also add the second question, or sort of second portion of that, is how do I include submitted but not yet accepted applications? I'll open that up for you guys.
So if it hasn't been submitted and it's something you're currently writing and it's in progress of being written, I wouldn't include that. In your letter, your statement of purpose, you can say, I'm working on my first manuscript, or I'm a co-author on this manuscript that I expect to be submitted January 2021 or whatever. I wouldn't include it on a CV. And then to kind of follow up with the second question, if it hasn't been accepted yet, you can put, what is that called at the end? In progress? There's a word for it. In prep. Yeah. So you can include that. Or if it's been submitted to bioRxiv, you can cite bioRxiv as where that manuscript is currently published. And then you can also say, sorry to just continue, you can also say it's on bioRxiv, in prep, submitted to whatever journal.
I think if you're early career, if you're in your undergrad and you were managed to make it into a lab and there's a group project they involved you in, which a manuscript comes out of that, I think you should include it in your CV. I think having it in prep or in progress, I think it shows that you're making strides to this goal of being in academia. With that being said, I have in prep one that is no longer in prep. On my current CV, it's definitely got rejected, and it's definitely being revamped and being submitted somewhere new. So I need to figure out how to include that or edit that in my CV.
So I'll mention, sort of what in the situation that you mentioned, David. I think, something along those lines is I did, in this thing, or let me see if I can find it real quick. There you go. So I put title, paper, journal name. So in a situation like that, where if it is in prep, or if you are, for example, writing up a manuscript, I would argue that yes, because you are showing that that you have this desire to be in academia. I would argue that it should be something that you're very close to finishing, but not necessarily like, oh yeah, we have this idea for a paper. That's that at that point you're just really in your early stages. And in a situation like that, where you're call it, where it, for example, got rejected or you haven't submitted it yet, then I would argue that you could put the authors, you could put the current name of the paper when you expect for it to be submitted, but maybe not necessarily include the journal. I know there's definitely a lot of been repercussions for that. If you say, oh, we're going to submit it here. Okay, well, just because you're going to submit it there doesn't necessarily mean anything. I could submit something to Nature Astronomy, but it doesn't matter because I'm just saying I'm going to submit to Nature Astronomy. That really doesn't add anything. In fact, it could also almost be a detriment. I didn't include this as a question, but there was a situation that I ran into earlier this year that I think may be applicable to some people. So I was part of a white paper or a community paper for a decadal survey for the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year. There were these white papers are usually written in amongst the community, but there are a lot of PhD students and sometimes even undergrads or external people who write this. And the question that a lot of us ran into or I should say early career people, the question that we ran into is this something that should be included in the CV? From the discussions that I had with other people, a white paper isn't necessarily peer reviewed. So it's not something that would be considered a publication, but it is something that you worked on, and it is basically up to that point a paper, just almost as if you had just submitted it but hadn't been reviewed yet. So in that case, what a lot of people agreed with is that it's best to include it, especially as an early career researcher, but just be very clear that it is a white paper. It's not something that's been peer reviewed. It's not something that is necessarily being considered for publication, but it is something that you worked on.
Yeah. One way you can get around that is just have another subcategory for non-peer reviewed publications, right? And then you can include other things that you wrote as an op-ed or some other thing you wrote for the university. And that can be really useful to include some other pieces of writing that people might not see that regularly and could help you stand out.
Another thing that I did include and I do mention, I think in my CV, is my undergrad senior thesis. So when I graduated, we had to do, for my track, I had to do a research project and then write a thesis on it. And so I do include that. I write like what the title is, and then I just put like submitted to the microbiology program at UW-Milwaukee. So they know that like I have some writing experience, and that was basically all I had coming into my PhD.
Yeah, and I think that the idea that David mentioned, something that's not necessarily having something that's there or a subsection that includes non-peer reviewed work would definitely help with that. And actually, not this question, but I do want to touch on that a little bit more in a second. So the next question would be, do I include a narrative about my research experiences? I would argue that, and I see David shaking his head, I did this particularly, so I wanted to make sure, because I had different research experiences where one was a population health, one was a plant genetics. So I wanted to make sure to write about it and, talk about the diversity of things that I did. I would argue that it's pretty common, but I don't know if anyone has any reasons why you would not include a research experience or a narrative about your research experience.
So I focus on the skills I gained from those experiences. So I have research experience with plant genetics. I have experience with microbiology, ecology. I have experience with genetics of like operons, and then my PhD is in infectious disease. And so instead of trying to be like, well, this, like I did this plant genetics, which interests me in this next step, I just say, I learned these skills and realized I was really interested in like molecular biology. And I used those skills to work on this that was relevant to my major because I had to do something for my senior thesis kind of thing. So focusing on like what skills you gain from those is how I tie my narrative together.
I included narratives when I was in undergrad and when I was applying to like graduate programs. I don't necessarily include narratives now. My CV is now pushing 5 pages, so I think including those descriptions doesn't add too much for my field. People generally have a pretty good idea of what that means and what that includes, like just the name of the research experience. And if they want to learn more about it, then they can just reach out. Or I also have a link to my website that does go into more depth about all these things I did as for other research experiences. So they could also go there. So.
I think, yeah, I totally agree with that. Now I don't really include a narrative, but for an undergrad looking for an undergrad research experience, I think it's important to definitely highlight some skills that you are gaining from these experiences. How involved are you in the project? I have trained undergrads who show up, take notes, kind of set up some stuff for experience I'm doing. But then I also had an undergrad who had their own experiments. And so like, where do you fall on that spectrum? Like, are you showing up helping with somebody else's experiment, or are you doing your own experiments? What skills are you gaining from that? So it's important to kind of be a little bit more detailed, especially if once you show up, like let's say you get this research experience, you don't want to have them think that you have more experience than you do, or less than you do even.
I still include a narrative, but I'm also very early in my PhD career, so I haven't gone past 2 pages. So like Kendra said, it's more highlighting the skills rather than like why I did it.
Yeah, so it's definitely important, in regards to, like what everyone's mentioned, what stage you're at, what you're necessarily applying to. So I think for at least, because the target audience for this is an undergrad, applying for either a PhD program or research experience, is that sure, it is okay, and it's probably even recommended to include that narrative, sort of like for what Kendra said, that you want to showcase what it is exactly that you're doing, as opposed to, for example, as a PhD student, it could make sense to write a narrative about what you're currently doing, but in that case, for example, it's not necessarily really important to talk about what exactly your part in it is, because as a PhD student, you're running the show, you're running your own project and your own research. So. And then, all right, so the last question. So this was a part that I personally struggled with a lot, is what else should I include? So I'll go back to the list of things that we included, or that we recommended that should be included. I agree with all these personally. Because personally for me, for example, one of the things that's important to me is science communication and outreach. I personally include science communication, or my science communication and outreach activities in there in my CV to showcase what it is that I've done and my experiences with that. But I don't know if you guys have other things that you'd recommend to include, or that you personally include in your CV.
Yeah, I include, outreach. I mean, I'm the outreach chair. I include that on my CV. I include things that we've accomplished, as like things that we've done as SACNAS outreach events that I've organized, stuff like that. I also include other volunteers. So I volunteer with the Ice Age Trail doing trail editing and conservation efforts, and I include that. So I think it is tricky. Like, you don't want to include every single thing you've done, but things that you want to highlight that are important that you can tangentially kind of relate to what you're trying to do. So if you're applying for a conservation position, or that's what you want to do your PhD in, or you want to do some research, you can say, I have a little bit of experience, I volunteer with this group, or something similar to that. And I think a lot of fellowships and PhD programs are really starting to look at what you're doing that's extracurricular. Because if you're applying to a PhD program, you're competitive. Like, you probably have a good GPA, you've taken all the classes, you've got a good GRE score if that's required. So they're looking at like, okay, but what else? What else have you done? And so anything you can highlight to really kind of get yourself like a step above, like, oh, but they've also done a few other things and they've maintained this good GPA. I think it's important to show a little bit of that.
Yeah, I've combined my outreach activities under the same subcategory as diversity. So I have diversity and outreach activities. So I list those. And then I also include leadership positions. So like Jaime said in the beginning, you don't need to include every club that you're in, but in those clubs that you are in leadership positions, then you can include those. And so then I have that. And I think that highlights pretty well all the things I do outside of academia, but are still related and still relevant. Yeah.
One other thing that I do include, so I'm working on a Delta certificate, which is like a teaching certificate through the university. And I include that because my current trajectory is I want to go into academia, I want to be a professor, and this is a way that I'm getting experience. So anything that you're doing to get experience outside of what is required for your research or required for your degree, you should definitely try to include that as well. And that also can include like workshops, which I know we've mentioned before.
Yeah, and those are all really good points. And actually, as we're talking about this, there was another idea that I had in mind is, David, you sort of alluded to this, is, for example, if you have a website or if you have, a social media account that is strictly professional or like you use for science communication, you definitely want to include that. Don't include your Instagram if you're, just posting, if you're just posting fun stuff. But like, let's say you're posting stuff about, oh, hey, look, let me talk to you a little bit about COVID-19 or something like that. Then that's definitely stuff that you can include because that's relevant to what you do and what you want to do also. So those are all really good recommendations. Are there any other recommendations that you guys have?
I think the main thing is make sure that you're following what they are asking for.
Yes.
That's like the number one reason that people get their applications thrown out is they ask for a 1-page resume and you are over, or they say have these margins and you are not within that margin. So just make sure that whatever program you're applying to, they're all going to be slightly different. And you're going to have to reformat. So I think like Jaime said, having a table that you can just like expand and can like change simply is a really nice way to go about doing that.
It takes a lot of time to format your resume correctly or how you would want it to look like. So you got to be patient with it and ask for different people for examples. A lot of people, the idea sounds straightforward. You don't want anything too flashy. You want to have it be really straightforward and you want it to be a good summary of you. But that in itself has a lot of different ways that allows it to be formatted and presented. And so just ask for examples and have other people look at it before you send it out. I think really helps.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely. So yeah, definitely have other people watch it look at it, and definitely being patient. I mean, I know for me, like I cannot use templates because there's always something wrong that like I don't like, and for some reason I can't change it. So there's nothing wrong with just simply starting, and making it sort of your own way and how you want it. But you definitely want it to sort of follow a standard CV structure, and we'll share some good examples of CVs, and we may potentially share our own CVs or our own resumes, so you can take a look at those. And yeah, if there are no other comments then I'll go ahead and close this out. Thank you for watching this. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions regarding your CV or your resume, or if you have any questions regarding research opportunities or PhD programs in general. At the time of recording this, it's December 6th, so PhD applications are usually due by now. But for research experiences, like summer research experiences, those are usually not due until later on. So we're definitely happy to help, or at least point you in directions there where you can find help with that. And also not only in even applying, but also, for example, looking places where you can look for experiences. So yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thanks, everyone.